Hey folks, so today we are going to be studying a little bit of Robert Frost's poetry. We are going to be covering a an author, a poetry author, every day for the next week or so, probably a little bit longer. And then we're gonna dive into some of their poetry. Now, Robert Frost is probably a name you've heard. I've heard several students mention to me that they've had to study one of his poems before. So we're going to look at those again today. So after you watch this video, just this is just a heads up. What you'll need to do is, if you didn't get a chance to watch it before this, go watch the really quick biography on Robert Frost so you can get some of his background. When you are studying literature or poetry, it's always good to have some context of who that author was that wrote that poem. Okay, so make sure you go watch that biography, and then there's also a reading of each poem that we're looking at today. Make sure you listen to those. Which leads me to talking about how you actually read poetry. Now, poetry can seem really daunting to some people, kind of scary, but I promise it's not. It's just kind of a larger story or feeling condensed into a few words that are very strategically placed. Now, I know that sometimes it can feel inaccessible, so here are some steps that you can apply to any poem to help you kind of break the code and figure it out. Number one is listen to the poem if possible. I mentioned that I have links to readings of each of the poems for today. Make sure you check those out first, and I think it'll kind of help you at least get a brief understanding or a vague understanding of what it's about. After you listen to it for the first time, go ahead and read the whole poem on your own. So power through even if you're a little bit confused. Step three is to break the poem up into chunks. Use the stanzas if the poem has them. Stanzas are essentially parts of a poem or kind of groups of lines. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So break it into chunks. And then for each chunk, find words that you do not know and look them up. Word choice, which is also called diction, is very important in poetry, and a lot of poets spend a lot of time searching for the right word. So if it's a word that you don't know, please just look it up. There's no shame in that game whatsoever. After you've looked up all the words you don't know, you can summarize the stanza or the chunk briefly in your own words. So you don't have to rewrite the poetry. It can literally be like, oh, he's thinking this, or in this section, this happened. And step six is to look for ways that the author uses figurative language. That's things like a simile or a metaphor and other literary devices. One that we focused on a lot this year is theme. And think about how that adds to the power of the poem. Okay, before we talk about Robert Frost's poetry, there are a few terms that I want you to know. The first one is speaker. A speaker is the one relaying the poem to the reader. A narrator relays the story or a book to a reader, and the speaker is like the poetry equivalent of the narrator. So when you have a question that asks what the speaker is saying, it's like the narrator, okay? The person who's speaking. Now, we don't necessarily say author. Why did the author say this? Because sometimes poems are meant to be kind of spoken by or thought up by a different character who's not necessarily the author. A line means the words in a poem that are all on one line. So for example, this stanza, which is a group of lines in a poem, has 5 lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's a pretty easy word, pretty simple concept. It literally just means, oh, there's a line. Think a piece of notebook paper. It's got those blue lines. This would be on one line, that would be on the next. And a lot of times they are marked off or counted by numbers. So this would be line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4, and line 5. A stanza, you've heard me mention that a couple times already. That's the group of lines forming the basic recurring metrical unit in a poem, also called a verse. It seems like a fancy definition here, but really, you'll see when we look at the poems, a lot of poems are typically kind of broken up into sections, and those sections are the stanzas. Rhyme scheme is the ordered pattern of rhymes at the end of lines of a poem or verse. These are usually marked using letters like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc. And this is what gives poem their classic feel of like, think the Who's Who live in Whoville, you know, they rhyme all the time. The Grinch hates it. The rhyme scheme is the ordered pattern of these rhymes. Some more important terms. A couplet is a group of 2 lines in a poem. So like a couple is 2. A tercet is a group of 3 lines in a poem. A quatrain is a group of 4 lines in a poem. A quintet is a group of 5 lines. And an octave is a group of 8. I skipped a couple because they're not as often used, and we need to know an octave for one of our poems today. Imagery is visually descriptive or figurative language, especially in a literary work. A literary work is something like a book, a short story, or a poem, or a play. A lot of times, imagery is just a lot of description that's very vivid and makes you feel certain things. A simile is a comparison using like or as. Here's an example. She is as sweet as a peach. However, a metaphor, while it's still a comparison, does not use the word like or the word as. So an example of that is, she is such a peach. Now, is that person actually a peach? No, but they're like one. So it's kind of 2 different ways of making a comparison. An alliteration is the occurrence of the same letter or sound at the beginning of adjacent or closely connected words. Fancy sounding definition, it essentially means that you're going to have the same sound or letter at the bunch of several words that are kind of in the same spot. A classic example is Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Okay, let's talk about Frost's poetry. The first one we're going to talk about briefly is The Road Not Taken. Now, I don't have the entire poem on this lecture because you need to go and watch the video of Frost reading his own poem and then take a look at the actual text for yourself. But we will talk a little bit about the structure of the poem here. It is 4 stanzas, which means you're going to see kind of 4 sections of the poem, and each stanza is a quintet, which means each stanza has 5 lines. As you can see, they're labeled here. All right, let's talk about the structure of the poem. Now, as you can see, this is no longer green here, it is blue now. That's because I caught an error and I changed it right quick, and I'll explain why I changed that. So we're going to look at the rhyme scheme here. And as you can see, I've got 3 words here that are labeled A. They're in the same color. And then I've got 2 words that are labeled B, and they're in the same color. Before I had this one in a different color, but it's actually supposed to be blue and not green, and it's supposed to be B and not C. And I'm about to explain why. So let's just read this right quick. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. So when you are labeling the rhyme scheme of a poem, you always start with the first letter A, and you start at the last word at the top of the poem. So since this is the first stanza, then this word, would, and its sound is A. It's labeled as A. Now you look at the next end rhyme here. Does both and would, do those rhyme? Nope, they don't. So it's got to be a different letter because it doesn't rhyme with would. Now stood does rhyme with would. So there's that pattern again. You're going to mark it as an A. Could rhymes with stood and would, so you're going to mark that as an A as well. And then undergrowth rhymes with both, and that's the reason why it is marked as B. So you could say that the rhyme scheme for this poem is A, B, A, B, and the other stanzas should follow that same scheme. All right, let's look at the questions right quick that you have to answer about the road not taken. The first one is, why do you think the speaker chose that path? Are there any clues in the text? Now, remember that the speaker is kind of the person who's narrating this poem. So you can't always imagine that it is the author, but sometimes it is. So after you've listened to the poem and read it on your own, you have to think, why did this person choose that path? And then the second part of that question, are there any clues in the text? If you can find me a snippet of the poem and quote it, that would really strengthen your answer. The second question is, what larger statement is Frost making about how to live life? Now, for this one, you want to think about what the theme of the poem would be. With our novels and short stories, we've talked about the fact that theme is kind of like a life lesson. So when this speaker is speaking this poem, or when Frost wrote it, what do you think he's trying to get across to us? And finally, the last question for this one, is he happy with his choice, and how do you know? The second poem that we're looking at today is Fire and Ice. And I'm going to put this in a part two, in the part two video. We'll go over Fire and Ice and Nothing Gold Can Stay as well. So make sure you watch the second half of this video.